We began to confuse the categories, to think to use the method appropriate to the second question, which is democracy. Democracy is limited properly to a discussion or a dealing with the second question. So, in terms of the way these words were used 150 years ago, I'd call myself a liberal Democrat. But you can't call yourself a liberal Democrat in public today without being grossly misunderstood. I'm a liberal in the old sense in wanting government to be very severely limited. I'm a Democrat in the old sense in saying the best method of choosing mayors and governors and presidents is to let the people vote. As Pericles said 2,500 years ago, democracy is where the many participate. We began to confuse the category. That is, to think that the methods appropriate to question 2 was appropriate for question 1 when Tocqueville was over here 150 years ago. He came over here in 1831, landed at New York, went to Boston, way out to Duluth, down to New Orleans, crisscrossed the continent, spent over a year, went back to France, wrote an immensely good book called Democracy in America. Tocqueville made a prophecy. He said that in America, in the middle of the 20th century, they will have what he called democratic despotism. Those are his words, democratic despotism. Now, if you were to ask, what's his name? 2 fellows running for the presidency at the present time, would you comment on the phrase democratic despotism? I suspect that those candidates, and ones even further back like George McGovern or Hubert Humphrey, would say, that's a contradiction in terms. If it is democratic, it can't be despotic. And if it is despotic, it can't be democratic. Nonsense. The worst tyrannies known to history are those which have occurred in our time under the rubrics of democratic centralism or democratic despotism. The people are appealed to for the authority exercised by rulers, and because the people say, in effect, well, we are doing it to ourselves, they've accepted worse tyrannical rule than they would have accepted under any monarchy. I remember talking with Eric Kennett-Ledeen, an old friend of mine, a couple of years ago. I told him this joke about the English men who came to New York. He said, can you imagine what would have happened if Louis XIV, who is the symbol of an absolute monarch, if Louis XIV had denied Frenchmen access to their wines, there would have been a regicide. But in a monarchy, people accept things. They wouldn't have accepted from some king or ruler whom they thought was not there because they put him there. Tocqueville said, in that time, our time, the wills of men would not be shattered, they would be softened and bent. People would become pliable, malleable. There wouldn't have to be concentration camps or whatever. Come down to 1859, a very unusual, forgotten professor of political philosophy was at Columbia University in New York. He had been at Chapel Hill, a German immigrant, Francis Lieber. Francis Lieber wrote a book in 1859 called On Civil Liberty and Self-Government. On page 415, Lieber said, on this very subject, woe to the country in which political hypocrisy first calls the people almighty, then teaches that the voice of the people is divine, then pretends to take a mere clamor for the true voice of the people, and lastly, gets up the desired clamor, unquote. Well, getting up the desired clamor is today called social engineering, or the engineering of consent. It's what Schumpeter calls the manufactured will. Small group, a tiny minority, of determined and sometimes unscrupulous men can plant stories in our media and then pump them full of gas and cause what seems to be the semblance of a popular movement of people. They can then point to this so-called movement and say the people demand this as a way of getting their program. I think it can be argued successfully that not a single plank in the entire welfare state platform was ever put there by the determined voice of a genuine majority. Every plank was put there by some minority group, a power group, a medical group, a business group, or whatever. A welfarist government is always up for grabs, to be seized by this or that faction within society and its power used to advance their program at the expense of the rest of us. I've defined liberalism, contemporary liberalism, as, quote, somebody's program at everybody's expense. Well, it's a fairly safe bet to say that most of us here are not altogether happy with a course of political drift in our time, in our nation, and in other nations. We think government is off base. It's off course, going in the wrong direction. We want to change course, change its approach and tactics. However, we know in our sober moments that the people in Washington or wherever are not simply them. They were put there by us in the broad sense of the American voting public. A nation, a people, a society gets the government it deserves, just as it gets the schools it deserves, the churches it deserves, the newspapers it deserves, etc. Edmund Burke, writing to his constituents, the electors of Bristol, had a famous sentence in which he said, there never was, for any length of time, a virtuous, a good government over a mean, corrupt, careless, sluggish people. Talking about us, or people like us, not the ones who are here in this room at the moment, but the American people across the boards have allowed things to happen, or have caused things to happen without knowing their consequences. The politics of a nation reflect the character of the people who comprise the nation. Can't be otherwise, unless it's a conquered country, and a conquest never lasts for any great length of time. Every government is government by consent. The people consent to it with varying degrees of intensity. If you want to alter the politics of a nation, you've got to elevate and refine the character of the people of the nation. It goes without saying. And the elevation and refinement of the popular character is the work of education, religion, art, ethics, education in the broadest sense of that word. Once there is this transformation in the individual persons who comprise the nation, government will almost automatically follow suit. Public life will almost automatically respond. The good news is that only a small number of men and women are required for this kind of a transformation of a nation. A handful of men and women who have latched onto a genuine and a sound philosophy of human nature and life in society, a sound philosophy of politics and law and economics. A small number of people who have explored the implications of this philosophy they have adopted in the various dimensions of life, and who manifest the idealism of that philosophy in the way they behave. Such a handful of people has gotten hold of a handle by which the world is turned. It's been said often that a tiny flame can ignite a gigantic conflagration. A tiny rudder can steer a huge ship. A little hunk of yeast will leaven a great big lump of dough. And a handful of people with dedication and the proper ideas can turn a nation around. especially one like ours, which at the present time is groping for new directions and new answers. Well, that's my story for this morning. I think. Okay. If there are any simple questions, I'll be glad to deal with them. Yes, sir.
Being a believer and a theologian and a kind of this study, how do you interpret the proverbs of train up a child in his own way?
Well, I like it.
I love it. But we
but
all misunderstand that, I'm afraid, with our children.
Yeah.
How would you interpret that?
Well, there is no society, no matter how primitive, which does not have certain rituals, ceremonials, educational vehicles to bring the newly born and the children of the tribe or the society into the adult way of life. So it's necessary that the young be taught how to transform their childishness into maturity. We have all kinds of pressures in our time that deter people from growing up, especially males. Women do a better job at achieving maturity than males do in our culture. The males have every encouragement to remain boys playing. I've often noted that there was no workman magazine. There was a popular Playboy magazine. So we have a group of males in our society who have been encouraged not to become men. So we've gone back on that ancient proverb, which contains complete wisdom. I don't want to talk too much about this because I've got a couple of stalks off the family tree here. Harry?
Your mentioning of women reminds me of a very good bumper sticker that the feminists have come up with. It says, when God created man, she made a mistake.
I've seen that one. Uh-huh. The what method?
The one where the information sources influencing voters put in politicians.
No question about it. I'll be talking about that more in my afternoon lecture, if you can survive that long. But there's no question but what our side, speaking broadly of our side, has been negligent in recognizing the importance of the various vehicles by which people's minds are made up or beliefs and opinions formed. Those would be the printed word, the spoken word, the press in the broadest sense, newspapers, periodicals, books, plays, or whatnot, the churches, the schools. All of these are vehicles for shaping opinion. Let me back up on that one a bit. Let's suppose that the year right now was 1850, 2 years after the Manifesto, 2 years after two Church of England clergymen, F.D. Morris and Charles Kingsley, had launched a movement called Christian Socialism. That was the name of the movement. Some good things about it. They wanted to recapture for the kingdom of Christ the realms of industry and trade. No one could take exception to that. Certainly, the Lord is the Lord of all of life. But in 1850, let's suppose that we're here. There was a clap of thunder like last night, a bolt of lightning, and all of a sudden, the great disposer of human affairs appears in our midst to assign to us our chores in life.